Good morning.
Good morning.
I hope the day finds everybody well. Excuse me, I've got allergies again this morning. My medicine hasn't kicked in. If you have your Bibles or your lesson books, we'll be in John the 15th chapter. John the 15th chapter. Our title of our lesson today is going to be Abiding Love. You know, last week we were in John 13. We're at the center of Jesus' discourse of the Passover week, I call it. The last week of his life on earth. Chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 are all of Jesus' discourse around that Passover. And his discourse is with his disciples. He's teaching them in the final hours of his life. You know, a lot of times we, or I do, get on the internet. I think everybody in here probably gotten on it sometime or another. We live online a lot of times. And you know, there's an old saying, what will we do if our phones and our computers were taken away from us? That's how attached we are to it. But you know, a lot of times, connections online can be fragile. They're not real. A lot of things that you see on there are not real. And you know, we have to put parental guidance even to our children, because a lot of times they get on there and get on the sites that they shouldn't be on. Though we are wired for a relationship with each other, we may find that those relationships a lot of times are not always what we think they are. And definitely, they're not what we need in our life. John 15 is the center, as I said earlier, the farewell discourse of his last week on earth. And you see that through John 13 through 17 chapters. In today's text, Jesus builds a case for mutual love. You know, last week he talked about serving and how he demonstrated to his disciples how he lowered himself to the lowest of all servants when he got down and he washed their feet. But Jesus builds a mutual love by using a common observation, talking about vineyards. And the grape vineyard, the grape harvest. You go back and you look at the Jewish history, the grape vineyard was a great crop for them, because it provided substance all year round. Grapevines are pruned, and I can remember when I was a kid, I can remember seeing my grandfather not pruning grapevines, but apple trees and peach trees and things like that. I didn't realize what he was doing when I was a kid. But as I got older, I did. Well, grapevines you find all through the Old Testament. Stories about the vineyards and about the grapes. And it was a way of life to these people. It offered food for them. It also offered drink for them. And it also offered wood for heat and for cooking. So what they would do when they would prune these grapevines, they would take and the wood and set it aside. And then when they needed that wood, they could use it for the fire. They would either burn it for heat, or they would burn it for cooking. So you see the analogy that Jesus is going to come about today in our lesson about the grapevine. It has a good meaning to the Jews at this time, because they're aware of what Jesus is going to say. So we see then in John, on the first 3 verses of John 15, it takes, I call it the introduction to this chapter. Jesus starts out saying to the disciples, I am the true vine. I am the true vine. And notice what he says. My Father is the wine dresser. I'm the one, I'm the vine. I'm the one that's going to offer you the fruit of life. But my Father is going to be the one that dresses the vine. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he will take away. Every branch that bears fruit, and he prunes those vines, that it may bear more fruit. In other words, Jesus is saying, I'm the vine, but my Father is going to do what? He's going to do the pruning. Those that bear fruit, he's going to prune them to where they what? Bear more fruit. But those that don't, he says, he's going to cut those and prune them away. You are always clean. Notice what he said here to his disciples. He said, you are always clean. In the last lesson we had, when he talked to Peter, remember when Peter asked him, said, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet? And then Peter asked him, after Jesus rebuked him, then Peter said, well, Lord, just wash my whole body. Well, he says here, you're already clean. What I did, I just put up a couple of pictures. But there's one thing I want to show you that is interesting. You remember in Romans 11, when Paul writes about the grafting in, talk about the Gentiles, in chapter 11 of Romans. I want you to look at this picture. As I said when I was a kid, I can't remember about what all Granddad did when he pruned trees. But I do remember him cutting things. And I can remember, as a small child, my granddad taking limbs and slicing and sticking them in and wrapping them up and grafting them into the tree. Well, notice here on this grapevine there where it says grafted union. Well, I got to wondering, I studied a little bit, because I'm not familiar with grapes that much. But it was common practice that over the years, that the root system and the main trunk of the grapevine would outlast the grapevine branches. I guess it's just like an apple tree or a peach tree. After so long, the limbs just don't burn no more. Well, I read an article where it says that when they get to the point that they are not bearing any fruit at all, they will take and bring in another type of grape. And they will graft it into the main trunk or the root system. And I thought what Paul said about we as Gentiles. Well, Jesus Christ is telling us this story here to his disciples. He said, I am the vine. I am that root system. I'm the one that's going to give you nourishment. I'm the one that's going to give you the ability to carry out your work. And he said, I will provide the nourishment for you. Then we see then in verse 4 when our lesson starts, Jesus says this to his disciples, abide or remain in me, in other words, and I in you. In other words, he said, if you will remain in me, I'm going to what? Remain in you. As the grapevine analogy, as long as the vines are pruned and as long as they are nourished, get the nourishment from the root system, they're going to produce fruit. And Jesus is telling his disciples here, if you will abide in me, then I will abide in you. As the branch, in other words, you and I, we're the branches in this story. As the branches cannot bear fruit on itself unless it abides in the vine. We as Christians, we cannot be a light to Christ unless Christ lives in us. We cannot reflect that light. We can't reflect what Jesus is like. The same way with a grapevine. If the root system is not good, then the branches are not good. But Jesus has told his disciples, I am the vine. I am the one that's going to give you what you need. Abide in the vine. Neither can you unless you abide in me. In other words, he said, you cannot produce fruit. You cannot go out and win souls to Christ unless they can see Christ in you. And that's what this story is about. Jesus is teaching his disciples here in the last hours of his life. I'm going to be leaving you, but all of the work is going to fall on your shoulders. Then we see then in verse 5, he says this again. I am the vine. He keeps telling them, I am the vine. In other words, you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him will bear much fruit. For without me, you cannot do nothing. I've said this time and time again. I don't believe that the disciples, at the time of the Last Supper, the last Passover, and Jesus' discourses that he gave in 13, 14, and 15, and 16, I don't think that the disciples really understood all of it. But I don't think they really started understanding it until probably about 10 AD, when Peter went to Cornelius. But he tells them here, he said, listen, he said, you know what the grapevine is like. But he said, I'm the vine, just like that grapevine is. You're going to be the offspring, in other words. You're going to be my branches. You're going to grow. But you're going to grow from me. And you're going to produce fruit because you are in me. But he also says you cannot bear fruit if you're not in me. If anyone does not abide in me, now notice what he tells the disciples here. You notice back in the Passover, he said, there's one of you that's not clean, didn't he? He was talking about Judas, remember? Now he tells them here, he said, if anyone does not abide in me, he is cast out as a branch that is withered. And they gather them and they throw those branches in the fire to be burned. Jesus is telling us that if you're not living the life that I am teaching you now, after I'm gone, if you don't live that life and if you don't teach the way that I have taught you, then you're going to be cut off from the vine. And you're going to be cast into the fire. That's another way of later on in his studies that he talked about. Jesus did earlier when he talked about there will be separation of the sheep and the goats. Then he says this in verse 7. But if you will remain in me, or if you abide in me, will abide in me, and my words abide in you, in other words, my teachings that I have taught you. And what did he teach you earlier? Servitude, wasn't it? Love. These are the things that Jesus was teaching his disciples. And he said, if you will abide in me and these words that I have taught you will abide in you, if you will place them in your heart and keep them in your heart, you will ask what you desire, and it shall be done for you. Now let me stop right there. I might say something here that you might disagree with. But there's a lot of people teaches, and there's no one that believes any more than I do when it comes to faith. But you've got people that will teach that we can do anything we want to do. Because they will say, Jesus told his disciples, as long as you be quick. Now keep in mind, and I'm not saying this to be sacrilegious, Jesus was not talking to you and I. Who was he talking to? He was talking to his disciples, wasn't he? And keep the content in mind. He's not saying it, and I think it applies to us today as Christians. Anything that we ask God spiritually, and it comes from our heart, He's going to give it to us. But listen, for me to go to God and say, I want to be a millionaire, no. That's the wrong attitude. That's not what Jesus is talking here to his disciples about. He's saying anything that you ask for that's for God's kingdom, anything in God's kingdom that you want to make better or you want to do, you ask the Father and it will be given to you. It applies to us today as Christians. If I want to do more work for the Lord in his kingdom here on earth, then I ask the Lord, I said, Lord, give me wisdom, give me knowledge, give me understanding. And show me what you want me to do. Remind me of one time of analogy that a preacher made one time. He was teaching and he said that one of his members came up to him afterwards, after studying this. He said, well, preacher said, I've been praying for a new Cadillac and I can't get it. Said, God just won't give it to me. He said, well, he said, son, he said, maybe if you ask God to give you a Cadillac so you can donate it to the church to bring people to church, maybe he might give it to you. You know, there's some little bit of truth there, isn't it? We're selfish at times. I know I'm selfish at times in my prayers. How am I selfish? I'll tell you how I'm selfish. A lot of times I will pray for somebody to get better. I don't know what God's will is. And I will forget at times in my prayer to say, if it's thy will, Lord, grant me this. You know, God told his disciples to ask. But ask it what? If it's thy will. So he's telling these disciples here, and he's saying, Matthew 7:15, we see this. He gives an example. He tells us, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravaging wolves. We see that today, even in the church today. We see how, and I've always said this, and you'll hear me say it, and you've heard Brother Chris say it. No matter who's teaching, no matter who's preaching, if they can't prove it to you with the Bible, then it's not even worth listening to. We've got too much out here of false prophets. And Jesus is telling his disciples, you're going to be persecuted. You're going to be called false prophets of people. And we know that even in studying Paul and his writings and as he travels, we've seen where he was also called out. We see in Jude 3, Jude writes this, Beloved, while I was very diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to all saints. In other words, Jude is saying the teachings that Jesus taught his disciples, the teachings that were passed on to us, we are passing on to you. And we exhort each and every one of you to maintain the faith and to stay in the faith that Jesus Christ himself has taught. And if you go back and you study the New Testament, and you study the disciples' teaching, everything that was taught by Paul, Peter, all of the apostles were teachings that came directly from Jesus Christ himself, the greatest teacher of all. Then we see in verse 9 this. As the Father loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in what? My love. Jesus is telling his disciples here in this discourse, listen, I loved you. I love you the same way that the Father loved me. And as long as we love each other, and as long as we hold on to each other, we will always abide in love. Love is the center of all Christian living. We learned this in our lesson before this. Without love, you have nothing, Paul says in Corinthians. We're just like an old sounding thimble, just clinging together. Paul even went as far as said there's three: faith, hope, and charity. In the 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians. And then he winds up, but he said of those three things, love is the mortar that holds everything together. If you don't have love, then you don't have faith. If you don't have love, you have no hope. And Jesus is teaching his disciples here in the last hours of his life on earth, as long as you will obey me and live in me and abide in me and in my truth and in my teachings, I will see that you will produce fruit for the kingdom. And we see that all of his apostles, all of his disciples, except for the one that was cast off like Jesus said they would be, was cast aside. And that was Judas. Then he goes on in verse 10 and says this: if you keep my commandments, Jesus says, you will abide in me. You will abide in my love. In other words, as long as you keep my commandments. Now, what were the two commandments that Jesus gave the lawyer? Remember the two commandments? The lawyer tried to trick Jesus, and he asked Jesus about the commandments. Jesus told him, said what? The greatest commandment is what? Love thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy might. Deuteronomy. Same in Deuteronomy. Then the lawyer went ahead and quoted this from Leviticus: love thy neighbor as thyself. Those two commandments, Jesus said, encompasses the whole law. He's telling his disciples, as long as you keep my commandments, as long as you love me with all your heart, your soul, and mind, and as long as you love your neighbors, and you abide in this kind of love, then you'll abide in me. But he says, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. What commandments did Jesus obey? Well, I think if you go back to Gethsemane, the prayer that he prayed in Gethsemane, that was when he looked at his prayer. He said, Father, if this cup can be passed by me, let it be passed. But what did he do? But he said, but thy will be done. So he obeyed his Father by coming to this earth and doing the things that the Father asked him to do. And he said, if you will keep my commandments as I've kept my Father's commandments, then we will abide together. Then in verse 11 he said, these things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full. In other words, Jesus is telling his disciples here now, he's getting ready to wind up this one discourse here. He said, if you will just abide by these things that I have spoken to you, you will have joy in your life. And your joy will be made full. Then we see in verse 12, he says this. Jesus does to his disciples, this is my commandment. Notice what he says, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Jesus was all the time the center of Jesus' teachings was always the love that he had for the Father and the love that he had for those that he had chosen. And notice that I said he chose, not that they chose, but the ones that Jesus chose himself to be his Father. And then we see in verse 13, it says this. This is, to me, is like putting the capstone on top of a brick house when you get ready to finish it. He says this, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friend. Well, you know, not only did Jesus on the last Passover bow to the lowest of servants to serve his disciples and to show them how humble he was and what servitude was like. Then he says this, because I believe he's preparing them, because he knows that they're going to go through life. Some of them going to be martyred. But Jesus says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friend. And then Jesus goes on in the next verse to explain this. He said, you are my friends. You are my friends. In other words, I'm going to lay down my life for you because you are my friends. If you do whatever I command you, then you are my friend. You're no longer my servant. You're no longer to serve, but you're going to be my friend. And I love you to the point that I will lay my life down for you. Now, I've asked myself many a time, in my faith with Christ, would I have the faith to give up my life for a friend? We don't know, do we? We've never been put to that test. But you know, if Jesus is our friend, and we abide in Him, we have a choice, don't we? We have a choice to either give our life up to Him, or we have the right to turn around and give our life to Satan. So we might not go through the physical death of giving our life to Christ, but we do spiritually every day of our life through our trials, through our troubles. As long as we abide in Him and through the faith that we have, we are giving up our life for a friend. Because Jesus said, if you abide in me, you are my friend. So we might not do the physical thing like Jesus did, or some of the apostles did. But we have brothers and sisters throughout the world that do. We go through the spiritual death in our lives. We are at war every day with Satan and his demons. And then in verse 16, you did not choose me, he said. He gets right down now to the nitty-gritty. He said, you disciples did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you. And I could just imagine when he came down off that mountain, the night that he prayed all night to the Father, and he came down and he chose his disciples. It wasn't something that was haphazard. It had a lot of prayer in it. He prayed all night to his Father to make the right choice. And he chose these disciples to be his followers. You that should go and bear fruit. In other words, I chose you. I appointed you now to go and to bear fruit. Your fruit should remain that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. As long as you ask for spiritual righteousness, as long as you ask things for the kingdom, then you will get it. And then in the last thing, these things I commanded you, that you love one another. He says it again before he goes. So I ask you this in closing. Is Jesus' fruit in us today? Are we abiding in him? Are we producing fruit through him? If not, then what do we need to prune out of our lives? What do we need to get rid of in order to abide in Him and Him abide in us? Is there something out there? Is it hatred that we have against somebody? And you know, we're going through a time now that we see a lot of it, don't we? We see a lot of hatred, a lot of disrespect, racism. We see it. We cannot, as Christians, and I say this with all of my heart, there's no way in the world that we can abide in Christ and Christ abide in us if we cannot see above and beyond the color of a person's skin.
Again.
And that's what's wrong with this country. We have got to the point that some of us think that we are better than others. But you know, all through our studies, all through Jesus' life, He's always said this: if we love one another, we will be obedient to the Father. But we can't not be obedient if we cannot forgive. If we can't turn our back and walk away from discourse. We have to be able to forgive. We have to be able to heal. And this is what this country of ours today needs. The church needs it. And it's no different today than it was in Paul's time. Look at what he wrote there at Corinth. They were discoursing, or even in the church at Corinth. Let us, as Christians, just try to obey what Christ said. And the whole center of it is love one another as we love ourselves. Thank you so much.